Yeah. Mr. Speaker, this debate happens from the perspective of Singapore and Malaysia, and what's the best way for them to achieve their foreign policy goal of protecting their citizens and their economy in the problems of Indonesia. We will consider at the onset that there might be some harms to Indonesian citizens, but we think as this debate happens, it says this House believes that Singapore and Malaysia should do this. We are purely concerned with the interests of these two countries and what's the best way to achieve it. What is the problem? There is massive slash and burn agriculture and pollution of the sea in Indonesia, which pose massive health and air quality risks to their neighbors around them. While this might not be a problem in isolated countries, the fact that Singapore is only 30 kilometers from the shore of Indonesia meant that you saw last year when 2 months in Singapore summer were covered by a haze because of Indonesian slash and burn agriculture. There was massive level of air toxicity in the air of Singapore, in which 2 people also died, and many people could not go to work and people could not go to school. The tourism economy was completely devastated in Singapore, given the fact that Singapore depends on tourism for a large part of its GDP. There were massive economical harms to Singapore because people could not go to work and there was no ability for us to be productive in any of the things we do because of the massive health risks these things pose to our individuals. There were danger to lives and danger to citizens, and we think the fact that when our citizens are dying and when there are massive health consequences to them, this is unjustified third-party harm and an invasion on our own soil, and we must act in the harshest of ways. But thirdly, there's toxic dumping of waste into the sea. The same sea that people in the Malaysian peninsula, both Singapore and Malaysia, use as a source of food for millions of people on their peninsula. We think that these things are extremely irresponsible and action must be taken. What is our policy today? We're going to have a moratorium on importing labor and force the government to alter policy. We will supplement this with other forces if necessary. We're okay with extending this to other things like the imported goods like palm oil and rubber. We're okay with extending this to other imports that Indonesia does, but we will start off with a moratorium on trade. We're also okay with providing them with massive subsidies and ability to change their agricultural reform. We're okay with, after they've accepted to improve their agricultural reform, we're okay with sending them expertise and money as we've offered already before at ASEAN multilateral talks before. We're okay with giving them as much as they need to try and improve this so that we can protect our citizens. Sit down. Why have other methods failed? Right? This is our first argument. Firstly, diplomacy has been tried and failed. There have been many effects to effect change both at the ASEAN and bilateral level. Because of the fact that there have been no conditions attached to this kind of agreement, Indonesia has been unwilling to accept this promise. But Singapore even offered to pay the Indonesia to change its practices, but saw no change in their incentives to do anything. But secondly, there's no political will in Indonesia, right? The fact that Indonesia has had a belligerent political attitude in this issue. They've even refused to apologize for the fact that their environmental practices harm millions of other citizens in other countries. As long as people in Indonesia see economic benefits of doing this and the government is impervious to change, we don't think there's actually any incentive in Indonesia to change on its own. We don't see how they're going to do this. But thirdly, they're not signatory to things like international environmental regulation or the international court mechanism. There is no other mechanism for us to implement this change through other means like multilateral talks or international courts because they fucking haven't signed the environmental agreements or haven't ratified them.
Sir,
before that, yes.
You argued that diplomacy had failed, but now you want to continue diplomacy and assistance with sanctions. How would that work?
Okay, this is not diplomacy and assistance. We're going to harm them where we can harm them most, economically. And this is where my substantive goal is coming, so thanks for that POI. Why is our policy going to work? And this is the largest chunk of my case. Firstly, import of labor is the biggest source of highest paying jobs and quality of life for Indonesian citizens. In Singapore and Malaysia, the two biggest ASEAN economies, which are geographically close to Indonesia. These countries are often the most attractive and economic and more feasible options for Indonesian citizens to get those high-paying jobs and give those remittances back. That's why we attract people on the ground. We take away a large source of opportunity for hundreds and thousands of workers who come annually to work in these countries. Not only do we represent a massive opportunity cost for those individuals, but their families as a whole. So we multiply back the 4 or 5 people or the 10 people in their family. Imagine the political will you have on the ground to affect change at the policy level, both the state and country level, Mr. Speaker. And this is extremely important because Indonesia is a democratic country, sanctions are likely to work faster and quicker than it would on undemocratic countries like Iran. That's why you saw South Africa, for example, a trade moratorium of 3 months led to the apartheid system falling because the economy was crumbling. That's the power of sanctions on democratic institutions, and that's why there's massive political will to do this. But remittances as a source of FX, right? And this is extremely important. I don't know how Mara gets this because they don't have a business school. The Indonesian trade balance is crude. Indonesia saw massive capital outflows last year. The currency has been beaten down massively against the US dollar, and their trade balance is extremely fucked. They have nobody to afford imports or conduct trade on the global level. Remittances from workers in Singapore and Malaysia form the largest chunk of FX inflows into Indonesia. And the Indonesian economy is a crippling point when they are in dire need of this FX and find no other source of it. So if Indonesia does not want a credit crisis or a balance of trade crisis, we think there's an economic incentive to not remove this massive source of economic outflow, and that's why our policy is going to work. Why would our policy harm us in return, right? And why do we think that's important? Firstly, we can increase quotas for workers from Bangladesh and the Philippines who usually do the same kind of jobs that Indonesia's workers do in our economy.
On that point, sir.
On most things, Mr. Speaker, these are usually unskilled workers. So even if they don't have the same skills, which we don't think they acquire in Indonesia anyway, training them is an extremely low opportunity cost for most companies because they don't require things like university degrees, but usually involve things like construction or menial labor. And that's why we give them quotas in the first place. We can easily replace these workers from other countries who are far more willing and equally willing to come to our countries and work. But secondly, Indonesia depends far more on Singapore and Malaysia than the other way around, and this is extremely important. Because why? The first reason is because we have other sources of labor. But Indonesia's largest imports, palm oil and natural gas, which are the only other source of specialization in the Indonesian economy, are something that you find in wide amounts in Malaysia, and you would know this, right? These resources are easily replaceable. We don't think that removing Indonesia from the scene is going to harm us. But thirdly, we will still have a competitive edge in trade as to the biggest economies. Indonesia is still forced to trade with us and accept our terms on other issues. So even if they feel pissed off, they don't have any ability to really get back at us, given our massive competitive advantage as well as massive global influence on the global political arena, because we're two of the biggest economies in our region, right? What is our end game from side proposition? And there are two things. Firstly, obviously to force the government to change the regulation, because you've seen other developing countries give up slash and burn agriculture, but Indonesia is the only one who's impervious to this change. We want an end game where they change their policy and stop harming our own citizens. But secondly, they harm so many of their own citizens, right? It's false and fallacious to say slash and burn is the most feasible form of agriculture, right? The fact that it often leaves the land barren, the fact that you often need to make many ecological shifts to different areas because of the massive harms this kind of agriculture causes on your own people, right? Countries like Indonesia, India, and Sri Lanka gave up slash and burn agriculture as early as 2004 because they recognize that it's an unsustainable form, right? The only reason Indonesia is not changing is because they don't want to change. It is because they're just impervious to political change and see no incentive to do so. We force that incentive on them. As long as other countries have policies which harm our people and their lives and their livelihoods, we will act, and we will act swiftly. I'm extremely proud to propose.
We thank the Prime Minister for his speech and we invite the leader of the opposition to make the case for the opposition.
It is morally abhorrent for that side of the house to be punishing innocent Indonesian civilians for a problem that they never contributed to. Acknowledging the common harm that we are all suffering, it is imperative of all responsible sovereign states to act with the conscience of preventing the most amount of harm while striving for that same objective of being effective in dealing with the problem. Why do we say this? Because we think there are alternatives that that side of the house did not want to consider, and what alternative will we be pushing from the side of opposition? We want to have constructive engagement and negotiations to create a common solution through centralized cooperation, Mr. Speaker. This is the kind of model that was used to help Brazil manage the Amazonian forests, Mr. Speaker. We can have international watchdogs, but most importantly, we can have several countries come together to help them manage it, because they don't have the kind of resources, and we can contribute those resources, and they don't have the kind of regulatory frameworks, and we can help them meet those regulatory frameworks. We think these things can happen with a centralized cooperation. That side of the house are unwilling to do it, because we don't know how somehow Indonesia can magically materialize the unilateral capability to handle their rainforests and their seas when they failed to do so since time immemorial. So why would this be particularly effective on two levels? Take the seat. This is not status quo, Madam Chair, because, Mr. Speaker, because they never contributed resources, they never contributed expertise to help solve a common problem. So two things. Number one, the environmental problem of haze, because of the slash and burn method of lumbers, is exponentially more economical. They don't have the kind of resources to log off lumber from one of the largest rainforests in the world and transport them to a disposal. So even if they wanted to, they couldn't have done it because they don't have the kind of resources and expertise. But secondly, the Kalimantan and Surabaya forests are absolutely we can contribute towards creating the kind of problems and the kind of solutions that will solve that problem. So acknowledging that the solution is something that we can all contribute towards and we can all benefit from, we think is a high imperative for Singapore and Malaysia to do it, just because it also solves all of the harms that they wanted to avoid from Singapore and Malaysia. So our stance, we think this better protects all three societies and this better improves the kinds of environmental problems that they wanted to solve. I'm going to be telling you two things directly clashing with everything that Anita told you. Number one, I'm going to tell you why it's worse for environmental progression on the ground. Number two, I'm going to tell you why there's a massive amount of unjustified social harm caused to the Indonesian society. But before that, a few rebuttals that don't fit in. Number one, they told you this debate is from Singaporean and Malaysian views, so we don't care at all about Indonesian society. We absolutely reject that. That is the kind of foreign policy sentiment that applies to states with absolutely zero diplomatic ties. And we have existing trade allies that we wanted to protect and people within Indonesia from our countries that we want to protect. No sovereign state will want to unnecessarily subject their allies to harms, especially when we tell you that alternatives exist. So when we want to mainly recharacterize here, we think there's a lack of malicious intent from the Indonesian society. The way they packaged it is as if because we want to protect our own people, therefore we have to punish Indonesia. Indonesia doesn't not have incentive because they just don't want to, because their own people are also subject to harms to a worse degree. Their own people are suffering from worse haze and worse environmental problems. It's not their fault that the state has to focus on things like infrastructure and social problems like poverty when they're one of the largest countries in the world with a very limited budget. We think it's not their fault that they're being demonized here, and we should all contribute to solving a problem that affects everyone. If they are indeed our allies, we should act responsibly and protect them as much as we can. Take a seat. Second rebuttal. They told you Indonesian dependency on Singapore and Malaysia will mean that they will change. We don't disagree with Indonesian dependency, so we think those parts of his speech which he largely contributed to was absolutely moot in this debate because there's no clash there. But still, three short responses. Number one, we think they may or may not want to change, but you could, their ability to change, Mr. Speaker, you turn them into a destitute Indonesia. I'm going to follow this more on my substantives. But secondly, the South African example is absolutely just analogous. Because in South Africa, the entire world banned it and sanctioned them. They might as well not have been a country. That's why the only alternative that they had was to solve all of the problems in order to recreate those diplomatic ties. This is clearly not the case with Indonesia. And thirdly, they say Indonesia may not retaliate because Singapore and Malaysia have the biggest guns. Look, Indonesia is the largest export market in Asia. You are losing an entire country where you can export all of your products towards. And if you get antagonized, then we think this will be a solution that they will retaliate towards. I'll forward them more in my substantive. So first, where's for environmental progression on the ground on two levels? But before that, yes.
Given the massive economic dependence of Indonesia and Singapore for FX and other things, do you think our policy will be quick in effect and will have a massive harm on the people in the long run?
I'm going to tell you how this affects the recalibration of the Indonesian government as to how they use their budget and why they won't be concerned with that and they'll be more concerned with forwarding for social equity on the ground because of the harm that you created. So two levels. Number one, how do you breed antagonism from Indonesia? Because this is an absolutely hypocritical stance from Malaysia and Singapore. Malaysia's environmental regulations is an absolute joke. We have no punishment at all for corporate pollution. We allow liners to set up in our borders and dump toxic nuclear waste and we give them tax breaks while they're at it. Singapore does stand barging to expand their borders for Marina Bay Sands and absolutely destroy marine life and ecosystems at the same instance. There's absolutely zero moral legitimacy for those two countries to forcefully impose their values for environmental information onto Indonesia. We think the conclusion of that, they will feel opposed to that unjust imposition and it regresses all kinds of cooperations towards common solutions. How do you contrast that with our alternative? We think when you give them funding, it gives you leverage to have autonomy and authority in decision making unto their policies. Because we contributed towards those policies, we are allowed to set the rules of the environmental regulations and be more easier for them to make concessions to what they can do when you give them those frameworks. On your side of the house, we will re-impose the kind of negative sentiments in the past between these two countries that were very only recently removed, and that's harmful. But secondly, labor force are Indonesia's largest economic export. Like they said, we think under their side, if you cut down their largest national income, you'll force a recalibration of the national budget to counter the massive social harms of unemployment. So number one, you further perpetuate the cause of the problem, which is lack of resources. But number two, you compel them to concentrate their remaining resources on the problem that you solve. So secondly, let's look at the problem of massive social harm. The deprivation of employment is the worst harm that you could have caused to Indonesia because income is the most basic human need, Mr. Speaker. Without it, literally, you are void of any possible progression for these individuals. This also makes your problem worse because you force all of the efforts of the Indonesian people to focus on putting food on the table and putting clothes on my back. If that is their focus, according to the mass to Indonesia because Malaysia and Singapore are the only countries they can go to due to cultural commonalities, and other countries being absolutely far away or them needing legal process themselves, Mr. Speaker, with you create competition for them in a way that they cannot have alternatives, and that's why you take Indonesia to a destitute state that makes them highly unlikely to focus on the problems that you wanted them to focus on. For all of those reasons, we are very proud to focus.
Thank the opposition for her speech, and we invite the Prime Minister to present the case.
Just last year, when the PSI level hit 400 and beyond in Singapore and Malaysia, the people of these countries were left reading. The rating was at a level that's scientifically considered hazardous. Life came to a standstill. Work was stopped. Schools were closed. There was a health threat to all people to the point of causing death to those most vulnerable in terms of physical health. We realize the pervasive nature of environmental damage, right? It's precisely because you're affecting the very air you breathe, the very world we live in. So any damage to our countries is highly crippling. Furthermore, it is not the first time it's happened. We have tried many means to counter Indonesia's haze problem, right, through things like subsidies. But Indonesia is independent and unwilling to use and do anything with the help we've given. That is why we need to move on to something a bit harsher and a bit more effective. I'm going to go into the idea of how alliances should really work, right, and that will counter a lot of their case. But before that, two rebuttals. First and foremost, what should the priority of Singapore and Malaysia be? They came in to us that we are punishing innocents of Indonesia, right? Now, first and foremost, in terms of foreign policy goals, countries always think in terms of how to protect their own people first. When the lives of our own innocents in Singapore and Malaysia are being compromised about what Indonesia is doing, then it's to step in and put these people first. But more importantly, we are also better for the common Indonesian man or woman in the long run, right? Simply because we help them check the environmental problems that they concede also hurts Indonesians involved in slash and burn cultivation. But furthermore, the damage is not as terrible for the common Indonesian as they may think. Why? Because the policy will be quick in effect. Because Indonesians are going to pressurize their government to end the moratorium by checking their hate issue. That's precisely why this short-term harm is better than any long-term harm to our citizens and Indonesian citizens. So thank you. That also brings down my entire social harm point, right? First and foremost, because it's fast, and also because we already considered from the start that unemployment will happen, but it is a good thing because it checks the major problem of environmental damages going on. Furthermore, we realize it's the only way to check this problem. They came up with a few alternatives, right? These are not new things. In Singapore and Malaysia has tried it many times, but it is not tenable simply because Indonesia is extremely belligerent about what is going on. They say it is not our fault this happens, so it can be easily checked. Even though there have been previous ASEAN-led environmental conferences about the problem, but it did nothing to resolve Indonesia's attitude. At the same time, there have been previous subsidies given. Also, Singapore and Malaysia have put in their own money to say use chemicals to create rain to resolve the haze. But all these measures are of no use because Indonesia firstly absorbed the subsidies. Secondly, Indonesia never ever stopped companies from allowing slash and burn cultivation in their land. That is precisely why anything we do, any money we give, any compromise we make, will only be pandering. That makes no sense. Thank you. Furthermore, right, that's precisely why our case, unlike as pointed out in our fixed POI, it's not intention. Subsidies are okay. We don't mind giving subsidies. It's not a concession because it has always been given. We just don't want Indonesia to mess up the use of subsidies to resolve the problem again. And we are so much more effective, right? Because people on the ground will now pressure the government to do something, so the moratorium affects that. Furthermore, we send out a stronger message. We're no longer going to soften you. We really want change and we're serious about it. Thank you. On to a second point about how we're being really horrible to Indonesia and airlines shouldn't be like that. First and foremost, an alliance works this way. You need to be mutually beneficial to all the countries involved. And also, when your interests are being trampled on, you need to assert yourself. What they really want, no thank you, is economic pandering. When you give all your resources to Indonesia, when you allow your people to die as a result of the case, like I say, okay, I don't want to make Indonesia upset. That's not really how it works. Furthermore, I'll show you in my case how we create better alliances, but that will be in a minute. On this idea though, of leaving Indonesia destitute, we see a tension here. We have a problem that's happening in Africa, right? They say that the sanctions in Africa only work because everyone stepped in and made a huge impact. Yet at the same time, you say, because 2 countries have been telling Indonesia, it creates a terrible impact on Indonesia forever. So we don't really see what they think is serious or not. Before I move on, I take a point.
If it is a zero-sum game where a Singaporean dies or an Indonesian dies, sure, the Singaporean government can save their nationals. But when you don't have to harm Indonesia, and you still actively choose to, how do you think Indonesia will react?
No, okay, first and foremost, right, I never say it's a zero-sum game. But I say that the priorities of our people are much more important because direct harm is being created for them. So we don't really need your extremist representation. But more importantly, and this brings me to my next point, right? I've already shown you Indonesia is not going to suffer. Why? Because subsidies already exist. You can do something about it. You can end the moratorium. And we don't think that slash and burn is so essential to what you are as a country and how you grow, right? Because slash and burn is something that leaves your land barren. That's why slash and burn never stops, right? You slash and burn one land, you don't cultivate it in a way that keeps it fertile, and then you move on and burn new land over again. So it's essentially more harmful for Indonesia in the long run. But furthermore, we realize that we are not really losing out either. Why? Because we have told you that Indonesia's selling point is its cheap labor market. That's beside, and we are the ones with the big economies and many allies out there. So we don't really think that either country is going to lose out. In fact, just pressurize Indonesia to move towards a conclusion that is best for both sides. So moving on to the last idea of thank you, sir. I'm going to now deal with this, with my case proper. Well, look at the regional level, right? Alliances. I'm going to show you how the image of different states and how they act will influence the political interaction and create greater stability in the Southeast Asian region. The desired outcome, as both sides say, right, is for Southeast Asian countries to all get along. That's especially in keeping with what ASEAN wants, right? A Durban-style, consensus-based core that stresses peaceful negotiation and coexistence. However, this desirable and feasible dynamic is only possible if you have a prevailing culture of equality and responsibility, where every state treats itself with equality, trust, and respect. And here is the problem. Here is what they are refusing to deal with regards to Indonesia. This is not the case in Indonesia. There's a huge big brother of the region mentality. We see it in the 1960s when Konfrontasi happened. We realize that this is far from over. This attitude also pervades recent developments. Like when they name their own shit of the perpetrators of the McDonald's house bombing in Singapore, we realize the refusal to break down about hate, a characterization they will not deal with, but yet they will not explain why this hate problem is recurring over more than a decade. So we realize that Singapore and Malaysia have tried to be tolerant, but Indonesia has begun to infringe upon their very crucial interests far too much. It is therefore time for Singapore and Malaysia to really assert themselves, right? To check the belligerence of Indonesia and to increase its willingness to treat them as equal players. Only then can Southeast Asian priorities, like peaceful resolution, like non-interference, like mutual respect, only then will these priorities exist. Only then can and will they exist. Therefore, what have I shown you? We talk about the social harms to Indonesia and Singaporeans and Malaysians, right? We told you first and foremost, it won't happen. Secondly, in terms of foreign policy goals, we have to prioritize the urgent socio-economic harms to our own people first. Thirdly, it's really the only way to create any change in the belligerent Indonesia. For all these 3 reasons, I'm extremely proud to propose.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister for her speech and we invite the Leader of Opposition to continue.
The side of proposition don't know what they're talking about. Indonesia is the largest economy in Southeast Asia. They just overtook Singapore recently, guys. They're part of the G20, and we think we have more to lose by not being friends with Indonesia. Ladies and gentlemen, this debate is about 2 things. The first thing is about what approach best solves the environmental problems that harms us and harms Indonesia. But the second part of the debate, ladies and gentlemen, is to assume that both of us will fail in convincing Indonesia to reform and consider the harms and benefits of doing that. Because they characterize that status quo has failed, diplomacy has failed, therefore it will continue to fail. But we also tell you that diplomacy with sanction will fail and bring more harm as well. So at some point we have to assume that both sides can't convince Indonesia to change, ladies and gentlemen, and we have to consider the cost benefit as a consequence of that. Firstly, why sanction with diplomacy would not work? Firstly, because it's morally incoherent Firstly, you are saying that we want to be friends and talk to you, but at the same time, we are punishing you. And while we are punishing you, here, take some money so that you can improve. We posit to you that they won't take the money, ladies and gentlemen, because they will hate us. Secondly, considering their characterization that the Indonesian government is belligerent, why would your sanctions work? Why wouldn't they just send their workers to other places and trade with other nations, ladies and gentlemen, outside of the ASEAN Pact? And ladies and gentlemen, why would they take your money considering your characterization that they are belligerent? They never came back to the South African counter that Mai gave you. That, you know what? In South Africa, because it was a UN sanction against them, hence they couldn't do anything. Indonesia, on the other hand, has China to go to, has other nations in the world to go to, ladies and gentlemen, and we think that your sanction won't mean anything because as compared to the rest of the world, Malaysia and Singapore can't hurt them. Lastly, they said that it won't hurt us because why? Malaysia and Singapore import things that we already have, like teak and palm oil. Firstly, Singapore don't have palm oil and teak. Secondly, Malaysia has palm oil and teak, but we use that for our export market in order to gain profits. If we don't import products from Indonesia, ladies and gentlemen, we will be forced to use our own palm oil and our own teak, harming the ability for us to profit from our export because we are forced to be self-sustaining, ladies and gentlemen, back home. And that is how it harms us. Secondly, we think that social mobility in Indonesia helps us because now when Indonesian workers come to become mates in Malaysia, for example, they get to take back the money, send back remittances, ladies and gentlemen, send their children to school, for example, make them educated to make them more aware about environmental problems and human rights, ladies and gentlemen, as compared to not having the ability to socially mobilize because they're broke, they're unemployed, ladies and gentlemen. That means that awareness towards environmental degradation would not take place in Singapore. We think social mobility helps us more than it hurts us. But lastly, they will come anyway, but through illegal immigration, ladies and gentlemen, that will hurt us. And because they said that Indonesia is so dependent on Malaysia, they will need jobs, ladies and gentlemen, they will come in anyway. Just like how Mexicans go into America, despite strong border control and immigration policies, ladies and gentlemen, that will create more social harms within our countries, ladies and gentlemen. That's why we think it hurts us, despite the fact that we can't change anything. Lastly, international relations. She said that this will improve international relations because, ladies and gentlemen, we're taking a more responsible action within the region. We disagree. After confrontasi, ladies and gentlemen, we established the ASEAN body in order to create economic interdependency. The same reason why EU was created, because 2 world wars just screwed up Europe. The way in which they wanted to prevent countries from going to war and being antagonistic towards each other is to create economic interdependency because they rely on each other's markets, ladies and gentlemen. So it's not beneficial for them to hate each other and go to war with each other. What you do is that you regress that. ASEAN has created economic interdependency that has watered down all historical antagonism that we have towards each other. What they do is that they re-spark that particular thing. But before that, I'm going to talk about 2 things in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about how do we best encourage Indonesia to reform their environmental practices. Secondly, I'm going to talk about how this harms Indonesian workers and harm us. And lastly, I'm going to talk about how their policy empower nationalist rhetoric by vilifying our countries, and that will bring more harm to us as well. But before that,
you contradict mine. Mine says that economy is harmed and people are dying. You say that it's always China and other people they get trade with and they won't be harmed. Which one is it?
Okay, there are several. It's not contradictory because it's true. Possibilities are true. There are 3 possibilities, ladies and gentlemen. And so I'll go to my second argument first because that's in relation to that. I just took one. There are 3 possibilities. Number 1, the workers will go elsewhere because, ladies and gentlemen, as they said, that unemployment is a big deal and they need to send their workers overseas in order to get work. It will still harm them, ladies and gentlemen, because the other alternative is countries like Philippines, Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam, countries that are irresponsible themselves when it comes to environmental practices and human rights. We think those countries won't have any incentive to force Indonesia to change, ladies and gentlemen. But secondly, let's assume that other Southeast Asian countries can't take them. They will send them to developed countries, which harm the ability for Indonesians to assimilate within those societies because there's no cultural similarities. At least in Malaysia and Singapore, they can speak Malay. There's religious commonality, ladies and gentlemen, as compared to being, white people being xenophobic towards these individuals in other countries, ladies and gentlemen. The second possibility is they can't go anywhere. When they can't go anywhere, ladies and gentlemen, we think that the country will be destitute. Like I told you, because unemployment will rise, crime rates will rise, the government will have to spend resources on solving those problems as compared to using that resources to solve environmental problems, ladies and gentlemen. And that prioritization of resources to solve social problems as compared to environmental problems doesn't help the situation as well. But lastly, the last situation is they will come anyway as illegal immigrants, ladies and gentlemen, and that will harm them even further because they don't get rights, they don't get minimum wage, they don't get protection, labor protection, they will be discriminated, ladies and gentlemen, and then countries will blame illegal immigrants for crimes that are committed within that country, and that harms the relationship between these two countries as well. That will spill over into other sectors, like we lose political soft power in order to trade with Indonesia and things like that. But let's look at why their proposal won't be effective in solving the problem. We have to recognize that there is hypocrisy here. When Singapore engaged in sandbarging by trying to expand their land, ladies and gentlemen, it impacted Indonesia and their coral and marine life as well. Malaysia have forests burning too, ladies and gentlemen. It screams hypocrisy. It empowers radical rhetorics in Indonesia and sparks old sentiments like the confrontasi, ladies and gentlemen, against Malaysia, because now they will blame us for not only harming their citizens but also being hypocrites. We are not doing it ourselves and we're imposing values onto them. We think that will not want them to cooperate because and improve environmental policies. What they will do is they will continue with their practice because they know that will piss us off, ladies and gentlemen. What we need is diplomacy without punishment. Both can't coexist with each other. The reason why we need to be friends with them and trade with them, ladies and gentlemen, is because we can be friends and convince them. If not, we can't. That is the best solution to this policy. They haven't come up to argue the harms and benefits if both parties can't encourage reforms. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of Opposition, and we invite the government to grab up the government, please.
Calm down. The biggest cop-out in Shafiq's speech was, well, we can't defend diplomacy alone actually working, so both sides are likely to fail, then what? We don't think that was how this debate was meant to work. We think that they needed to prove that diplomacy was likely to work in order for them to win this debate, because we told you that diplomacy hasn't worked in a decade and they needed to find an alternative. We're going to do two things in this speech. One, how do we incentivize action on the Indonesian government's part? Secondly, we're going to look at relationship between countries and all the hypocritical contradictions that I wanted to talk about. Let's start with how do we incentivize action. For that, we need to look at what status quo is. Singapore has given subsidies, assistance, started up new shared departments to provide technology to them and allow for ability for all of this to happen. The excuse that Indonesia has used is exactly the characterization Mai gave you at the start of this debate. It's too difficult to regulate, it's hard to check, they're a large country, they don't have the ability to do things. Please give us an exemption on the conditions of the subsidy because we're not able to. The argument on that side is to say, let's continue doing that and hope and pray things change. We don't think that actually works. Singapore and Malaysia have been highly tolerant with all the excuses they've given us for not meeting the conditions of existing subsidies and existing amounts of money that have been given to them. The argument on constructive engagement on that side makes absolutely no sense considering the ASEAN Environmental Pact that already exists. We think that dialogue and shared futures have failed in the last decade and we need to incentivize action on the ground. The reason why there's no action happening now is because there's no support on the ground for it. Yeah. Because people on the ground can continue to earn money, continue to have fantastic livelihoods from exploiting the environment and from causing harm, not just to themselves and to their own people, but to countries beside them. We think that what we need to do is to incentivize support on the ground.
How do you do this? Considering or considered in mind the massive economic harm to the people because of it, which is kind of weird because Shafiq claimed that there was no economic harm to the people. But it incentivizes the people to push their government to get them their jobs back, their food back. Because it's very strange for mine to come up and say, well, now that they're hungry, they're not going to be able to push the government into anything. Seriously, it's exactly because they're hungry that they're going to push their government into getting them their food back, into getting them their jobs back, so that they don't go hungry, and so that they don't last that way for too long. It was contradictory for mine to come up here and say the South African apartheid sanction worked only because it was extremely harsh and expressively harsh because all of these different countries did it, but at the same time it won't work for Indonesia because it's too harsh and people won't think about it. They need to decide what actually works. We think it incentivizes action far better when people on the ground can push their government in a bottom-up approach to want to do something about it, so that the government has incentive, because they're a democratic nation, to want to be able to solve these issues. We think that the excuses for how it's hard to regulate have gone on for far too long, and something needs to be done to incentivize action. When we go then into relationships between countries, the argument from them is, well, they will hate us. Indonesia is going to absolutely hate Singapore and Malaysia, and they're going to stop all relations with Singapore and Malaysia because of it. They're going to stop trade, they're going to stop all kinds of relations with Singapore and Malaysia. We think that's stupid, because eventually, beyond the rhetoric and ego of the politicians on the ground, it's against their benefit to hurt relationships with the closest neighbors that they have. We think it's far worse for Indonesia to be so much more antagonistic simply because they were ineffective as a government and they were unable to make policies work. Before we go into why we think the three different possible alternatives Shafiq wants to talk about are actually really dumb, go.
Hierarchy of needs means they'll be knocking on doors looking for jobs, because going on rights while remaining unemployed does not address their immediate need for food and clothes on the back. How do you address people not wanting to create the pressure that changes environmental policies?
Look, individuals on the ground can't just knock on random doors and have jobs appear out of nowhere. The way to do that is to pressurize the government to create jobs for them and to create food and environmental policies for them. For that to happen, they need to get trade with Singapore and Malaysia back on track. It cannot happen simply because the people are going to be unhappy and randomly on the streets. Eventually, they're going to realize simply looking for food without pressurizing the government to actually give them food is going to fail. Let's look at relationship between countries and the three alternatives Shafiq wanted to talk about. The first was they will go elsewhere. You know what? People are going to go to Laos and Cambodia and Philippines. Really? Because Laos, Cambodia, and Philippines have their own cheap, uneducated labor that they are trying to push to other countries around the world. There is absolutely no way that Indonesia's cheap labor is going to be accepted by other Southeast Asian countries around the world. Most of Indonesia's cheap labor goes to Singapore and Malaysia. So no, it's unlikely that that's going to work. The second thing was they're going to go to the West. But there is low incentive to do exactly that, exactly because of Shafiq's characterization, because of the cultural sensitivity of the issue, because of the xenophobic likelihood for these individuals to be isolated and alienated and to be hurt. Right? The likelihood is that they are not going to want to go to the West. The third option was, well, they're going to be illegal immigrants. Sure, they can try, but Singapore has the strongest borders that always throws them back and deports them in the most likely scenarios. We think that the likelihood of them actually ending up as illegal immigrants is low, which means the last option is only the best. The one where Mai talked about at the beginning of this debate that Shafiq contradicted throughout his speech. That is going to be extremely harmful to the individuals, that people are going to die and lose their jobs, and it's therefore morally abhorrent. We don't think that that's how it works. The argument from that was Indonesia has the ability to pull its weight. We think that's directly contradictory to the kinds of analysis that Mai wanted to give you about how Indonesia is destitute in talent. We think that Indonesia may be big in size, but consumer wealth is concentrated in Singapore. We don't think that Singapore is losing out to Indonesia based on it. We think at the end of the day, Indonesia will still sell to all the different countries because there's incentive for Indonesia to do it, because that's the only thing that their growth and their GDP and their economy is dependent on. We don't see why on that side that Indonesia will choose to jeopardize everything in their country simply because they don't want to effectively implement some environmental policies. That side needed to tell us what their effective solution was, considering the constructive engagement has failed, considering that the ASEAN Environmental Pact has failed. We think that because you want to push the people towards change, we are happy to admit that in that the government would be more effective in putting in policies in the long term. The argument on that side was there is no moral legitimacy for this to happen. Yes, there is, because there's unjustified third-party harm to my citizens. I have the right to call out another country for doing something that harms my citizens. We think that's enough moral legitimacy for these countries to want to push that burden on Indonesia. We're very proud to propose.
We thank the government for a speech and we invite the opposition whip to wrap up the concept.
Mr. Speaker, it was easy for the Singaporean team in this room to use the livelihoods of Indonesian laborers as pawns in a regional diplomatic chess match without considering the larger long-term costs of potentially A, losing Indonesia as an economic and a political ally, as well as antagonizing the already belligerent Indonesian government, as well as a fractured and healing society that we once were at conflict with. The burdens that they took upon themselves was A, to say that there's a lack of political will with a belligerent Yudhoyono administration. But we question them, how will this model then incentivize any sort of change in political rhetoric or political will? How will that not make Indonesia export their resources to other larger markets and prioritize economic development even further rather than looking at environmental regulations? We ask them, how will this then change the attitudes of Indonesian people, given that we've had past confrontations with them in terms of political and economic ties? We say that how is it that when people lose their jobs and their livelihoods, they will now push for the most controversial political move, that is environmental regulations over economic development, ladies and gentlemen? We told you in this debate, and we brought you the most accurate characterization, that we said that the problem with Indonesia is resources in terms of finances, as well as regulations and enforcement. So how will millions of unemployed Indonesians who have lost their jobs in Malaysia and Singapore now suddenly, and the Indonesian government potentially losing the export market, how will that make up the cost of the environmental regulations that they want to enforce to you, ladies and gentlemen? In my speech now, I'm talking about two things. How do we create political will to change their ways, and how do we change social attitudes in Indonesia? The first thing, how do we create political will for Indonesia to change their ways? Let's look at where this debate is already at. The government side said there's a lack of political will to reform policies, and secondly, Malaysia and Singapore have economic sticky power in order to force quick change in Indonesia. On the opposition, we said two things. One, the friendship between Malaysia and Singapore has been strained in the past, given our past political conflicts. Secondly, we need resources to direct towards these costly environmental initiatives. The way that I'll resolve this issue is to A, show that under their model they harm Indonesia's economic capacity to reform. Secondly, I'll show you how it's politically unstrategic to support environmental regulations under their model. The first response we say is, on the basis, Malaysia and Singapore are very unlikely to want to do this. Because A, when they told you that they're likely to cut off ties in terms of palm oil and petroleum, national resources of Malaysia and Singapore are usually exported to the West and we import it cheaper from Indonesia. If now we stop importing from Indonesia, that means we have to use our palm oil and our petroleum for our own people. We think that's likely to harm our export market because we're likely to have more economic costs of exporting rather than importing from Indonesia. It's economically silly, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, we say that it's also economically silly for Malaysia and Singapore because the cost of businesses and schools closing down during haze is nominal compared to the loss of cheaper labor that we're likely to have from Indonesia, ladies and gentlemen. Indonesia is in the G20 and it's projected to be one of the largest economies in Asia. We don't think it's strategic to cut ties with them at the moment. Secondly, we say, how does this harm political will? We say, ladies and gentlemen, that it's actually not true that Yudhoyono is so belligerent. We say Yudhoyono actually drew a lot of flack from Malaysia and Singapore and the rest of the international community and actually attempted to push for certain changes and push the rhetoric that Malaysia and Indonesia are neighbors. That's why Yudhoyono asked Malaysia to send their firemen over to Indonesia to help put out the fires. That's why they asked cloud seeding technologies from Malaysia in order to make it rain and stop haze, ladies and gentlemen. Because what you make is that you make supporting environmental regulations, i.e. pandering to Malaysia and Singapore, even more politically unstrategic
for the Yohana government, ladies and gentlemen, because now you're trying to push that rhetoric onto these millions of unemployed Indonesians that have lost their jobs in Malaysia and Singapore. The example we have here is in Myanmar. When the West sanctioned Myanmar, it made the West it created antagonism towards the West, and it made Western values like democracy less attractive to support, ladies and gentlemen. With it's politically unstrategic and will draw a lot of flack. Because under your model, there will be higher support for nationalist parties like Parti Nasional Muda and Angkatan Irian Indonesia, who are very happy to allow Indonesians to do whatever they want in the name of economic capacity. Thirdly, we see that under your model, that government is likely to direct government spending away from environmental initiatives into things like job creation. Because under your model, generally, right, environmental initiatives like things like carbon tax or reducing CFC output or like better agricultural practices require higher economical costs. But under your model, because so many people have lost their jobs, the Indonesian government will now have to spend that money creating more jobs, ladies and gentlemen. What that gives them is it gives the Indonesian government plausible deniability to not reform the environment policies. Because all they can say is, we have all these millions of Indonesians who are unemployed, we have to create jobs for them. Why the hell would we want to consider environmental reforms, Mr. Speaker? Fourthly, we tell you that if their model extends to economic sanctions, it's likely to force Indonesia to turn to other markets and other pollutants. We think it's likely that they will cut trade with Malaysia and Singapore, as they said, and move to individuals like China or Myanmar who have really lax environmental regulations. At least Malaysia and Singapore are prime movers of environmental reform policies in Southeast Asia. Before I move on to my second issue,
if job creation is a problem, why would you just fix the environmental problems and get all the jobs back rather than stupidly spend money creating jobs which don't fall from the sky?
Right, well, let's consider it, right? A, you either create lots of jobs, i.e. build factories and stuff like that, or you have to spend millions and millions of dollars having to import technologies, environmentally green technologies from the West, which are a lot more marginally costly rather than building a factory or creating more jobs. We don't think you make economic sense. Secondly, how do you change social attitudes? The government told us that taking jobs away from people and making them starve that's how we find change. The opposition said because we share similar cultures, but it's a highly volatile relationship, we think that we need to consider antagonism. The way I resolve this is to say that they make Singapore and Malaysia unattractive and it changes social focus away. Under our model, we told you two things. One, it's likely to make a lot of people unemployed, which is likely to breed antagonism against Malaysia. Already, Indonesia and Malaysia has passed social and political strains in terms of our cultures and our political ideologies. We think as millions of people lose their jobs and all these farmers who conduct these slash and burn activities, we think it's likely for them to say that why in the hell should we change our ways? Because Malaysia and Singapore, who are the largely most affected people as a result of the case, are no longer our friends and no longer supporting us. We think it's likely to bring up all these past historical wrongs and breed antagonism. But secondly, we say and responded to this by saying that it's unlikely for millions of unemployed Indonesians, because they're starving and their children can't go to school, that they're likely to go on the streets and protest and join green initiatives and green movements, ladies and gentlemen. They're more likely to focus on getting a job. We think it actually harms the ability for people to accept these environmental regulations, because at the end of the day, they're focused on getting jobs and basic income. At the end of the day, we told you that if we continue giving these people jobs, if we continue having them as our ambassadors and our spokespersons in Indonesia to say that we should stop these changes, that's exactly how we will force change. We are very happy to oppose.
While we thank the opposition bit for his speech that we have ended the constructive rounds, we move to the reply speeches and we invite the reply speaker.
That's if the House give generic argumentation on sanctions will incentivize change without examining the geopolitical realities of our relationship with Indonesia. Because by their own words, somehow Indonesia is so stubborn and will never change, yet somehow when you antagonize them, they suddenly will change, Mr. Speaker. Examining the reality that Indonesia will suffer the brunt of all the environmental harms that you speak of. We told you by right, this is a sovereign state that does not want to maliciously harm its own people and their own allies. And now even if they want to, they cannot change. They didn't want to engage in the fact that our problem contributed to the lack of capacity, that they cannot solve the problem. The Kalimantan forest is too large to regulate and enforce, Mr. Speaker, that they could not find any resources as an alternative to slash and burn. So this is hurting them so much, yet you don't have the capacity to change. That's why the House never wanted to engage in the fact that they contribute towards the same problem that created the very harms that they wanted to avoid. So before I go on to a comparison of policies and why this will ultimately bring absolutely no positive impact, I'm going to make a few clarifications, two in particular. Number one, they think because we are dynamic and because we've shown you great showmanship by examining you the myriad of possibilities, that somehow we are contradictory. We give some of you credit because we're nice people. Guys, the only thing that you should recognize is that in all those myriad of possibilities, the end outcome is they will be severely harmed. We didn't want to engage with that. So if they don't go anywhere, they will be harmed. And we told you in Shafiq's speech, even if they did go everywhere, they will still be harmed, guys. Engage with that. But the second clarification, you said this is a contradiction. Indonesia will suffer economic harms, so why would they want to shut down the economy further by alienating Singapore and Malaysia? First, your conclusion is irrational. If we shut down our market for your export, we harm you, not us. We can get exports from everywhere else, so we don't care if you get harmed because you are harming us. That's why our harms are not harming ourselves. But even if we engage with that, again, dynamism, not contradiction. Secondly, economic harms are things that sovereign states are willing to undertake when you give rise to toxic political rhetoric that forces them to be nationalists, that forces them to tell that our allies have demonized us, and therefore we are willing to suffer those harms because you have acted unjustly with no moral legitimacy. Let's look at the comparison of policy on two levels. Number one, they told you status quo has failed because we talked and then we give them money. That is nowhere near the level of cooperation that came from the side of opposition as an alternative. Those are independent, separate efforts. We told you a centralized effort. So we're not going to here have subsidy and make your own rules. We're going to sit down on the table and tell them what those rules should be. We tell you by creating that kind of organization, those funds create leverage for you to decide what are the environmental frameworks, and you give them the people to enforce them, and you give them the expertise to create those rules. So even if you are similar, again, being dynamic, you still need a progression of the same method to achieve a level of a greater efficiency. They didn't want to say why diplomatics fail now and somehow they will fail again in the future when we show you that better cooperation creates better incentives to create changes. But secondly, how will they change? They never show you methods on how they will change. So firstly, they said somehow it's pressured by the people. Because poor people are so sophisticated that when they don't have money to feed themselves, they will go on riots and demand for money. But they cannot, because for the time that they go on riot, they'll be unemployed and there's no food on the table. They'll be so intensified in their efforts to look for jobs because jobs are right at the end. Because the government cannot suddenly give you jobs. That's why they'll be less focused on political pressure and more focused to feed myself and my family. But secondly, we're anti-TSPI as well. It's so easy. There's so much unemployment. Why don't we just take that money for unemployment and put it into environmental efforts, guys? Because it's not easy, it's expensive, and we don't have people, we don't have resources. So for the years amount of time when she created a environmental framework, for what, 4 to 5 years, our people will go hungry with no jobs, being unemployed. That is the kind of incentive that no sovereign government will undertake. You will be pushed to focus on giving people those jobs. That's why any kind of recalibration of the national budget has to go towards solving the social problems that you contributed to, and not the larger environmental problems that is the cause of those social harms. I think this will be worse for any kind of environmental that you wanted to create. Versus our model that was simple and easy and directly tackles the kind of lack of environmental enforcement that you wanted to solve. We are very proud to oppose.
Thank you, the speaker from the opposition for her speech, and the speaker from the government.
How is Maratu like Indonesia's environmental policy? They have constantly put out smoke screens, refuse to engage the other side, and then pretend that it's all okay. I'm going to do 3 things today. I'm going to weigh the debate for you, alright? So first and foremost, who provides the best check on a very pertinent haze issue? Do you think it's problematic that Shafiq came out and said, both sides are not going to succeed in solving the haze, so let's drop that point? Because first and foremost, if that is the case, 1, what is the point of this debate then? Secondly, thanks to your concession that you are not going to effect, but we are not conceding. Because thirdly, we have told you that a moratorium incites pressure on the Indonesian political elite. First, in terms of true economic impact, and secondly, in terms of things like how the locals at home are going to get angry and want change. So if you weigh the priorities, right, Shafiq is unfairly trying to dismiss the case as not a priority. But the facts we gave you still stand unrefuted. That the PSI level has risen to terribly unhealthy levels. The effect on day-to-day life in Malaysia and Singapore. The innocence affected not only these 2 countries, but across all 3 countries. But especially our 2 countries, the wind blew the haze over, right? And furthermore, that soft approaches have failed many times over the past decade because the Indonesian government took all the subsidies and used it in corrupted ways. So nothing was really done, no money was given to them. Which will also told you how there are many economic incentives for Indonesia to change if you create a moratorium. Their only response is as follows. They have a shifting characterization. Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia are sometimes poor and sometimes not, depending on what they want their economy to be. It is really mutually assured destruction on their part, right? First and foremost, if Singapore and Malaysia are the poor ones in terms of their relationship with Indonesia, then no Indonesian innocent will be hurt in as a group. Indonesia will be very happy to send its people to Laos to work instead. So mine's point is gone. But if Indonesia is the poor one, then one, we do have an impact, so our case stands. And then, how can it be that Indonesia will be too mad to respond to obey if it's the one that's suffering? So then Shafiq's point is gone. I'm not really sure which speaker they want to keep most, I think both are gone. So basically, right, we think that we must take a stand in this case, because the haze issue is the top priority of this debate. It's a recurring problem and a serious one in Canada's life. So we've basically abided by the middle ground and a lot more realistic. We told you that yes, Singapore and Malaysia have more money. They're not invulnerable, but they're the biggest economies in this region. And Indonesia does send many workers to these two places to work. It is true, right? So basically, Indonesia would not sell this drug, right? The moratorium will make understand that a huge pinch is being put on it, and it has to respond to stop this pinch. Let me turn to the second issue. And what is the best form of diplomacy? I came out and told you my substantive that you must have self-assertion with subsidies at the same time, so that Indonesia knows that you must take us seriously and not let our priorities and our interests slide. That was completely dropped altogether. If they really understand geopolitical realities, maybe they should listen to us a bit more. Their policy, however, is to just tender them, to give money, to sit down and talk. So this happened many times in the past decade, and the haze just happened last year over again. So they want to wait and see, and hope somehow now an impact suddenly happens. But assuming that this point doesn't fail, and assuming that our point was somehow rebutted, though it wasn't, right, let me weigh the two issues as though they're equal anyway. First and foremost, they have considered there's a need to check the haze. I'll show you why that's important, right? So we think our case is still more important. Furthermore, we are showing there's already no choice because past measures have not worked. So you need to do something a little harsher. At the same time, we told you that what we're doing is not as horrible as Rafiq seems to think it is, right? Because out of the arsenal of political moves, it's actually a very reasonable one. It's not as though we're going to nuke Indonesia, right? We're already putting a moratorium. It has an effect, but it's not terrible and a complete cut off of ties. Furthermore, what we have shown you, right, is that we create a better alliance. And also, we're trying to tell you that countries are not like play schools, right? Where if I do something to you, you stop being friends with me. It's not like that. Countries judge on the rational calculus of political and economic need. That is why Indonesia is on the cut off all ties with you. So lastly, in a sense, right, we told you, yes, there is unemployment, but our people matter more, and anyway, it's short term. So basically, we realize, right, with a situation where we can't do anything. With Malaysia and Indonesia, that they concede when they say they're scared Indonesia will get angry. They're given money many times, but it is not working. On the side note, we also show you how it's better for Indonesians to shift from unprofitable and unproductive/animal cultivation. So at most, we cancel out if we don't win the entire point Indonesians, and here we show the only ones that show you why the haze must be checked for the locals in need. For all those reasons, I'm extremely proud to propose.
Speakers for the speaker,